Hey, Global Village. Okay, I believe that Donald Trump has been compromised by Israel. I believe they have something on him, and I suspect it likely relates to some kind of sexual misconduct. And I want to present my case as to why I believe this. Now, I don't think I have, well, I know I don't have incontrovertible evidence to this, but I think there is enough collective evidence for us to seriously entertain the possibility that Trump is indeed compromised, and that it would probably do the best job of explaining what's happening and why it's happening the way it is. So let's start from the beginning. Who is Donald Trump? Or more importantly, who isn't he? And what he isn't is an ideological Zionist. You know who was an ideological Zionist? That would be Joseph Biden. Biden is on record for having said if there wasn't an Israel, America would have to create one. So the question you have to ask is, why did Benjamin Netanyahu have a strong preference for Donald Trump winning the presidency over Biden? And the thing is, Donald Trump is your quintessential grifting con man. He's the kind of guy who you don't want to turn your back on, because he will stab you in the back if it serves his best interests to do so. And I put it to you that Israel would not want a man like that in power, because he would be just as likely to betray them as he would be likely to do their bidding, depending on his own personal agenda and goals. On the other hand, if he was compromised, if they had an ability and way to control him, that completely changes the equation. And in that instance, he is exactly the man you would want to be president if you were Israel. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is Donald Trump's history, because we all know he is guilty of sexual misconduct and misadventure. He has a long history of it. He is convicted in civil court by Eugene Carroll, and that's to the tune of over $5 million. He's on the hook for his conviction. The point being, we know he cannot keep it in his pants. He has had a long history of that. It's just one of his characteristics. And who was one of his best mates? Well, that would have been Jeffrey, and I'll just call him by his first name. And who was Jeffrey's right-hand woman? Well, that would be Ghislaine Maxwell. And who was Ghislaine Maxwell's father? That would be Robert Maxwell, very close friend of Israel, and whom died under very mysterious circumstances, and whom was given a state funeral in Israel. Something very odd for someone who was not even an Israeli. Robert Maxwell's connections to Israeli intelligence is not really open for debate. That's just a known fact. So there are not many degrees of separation between Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey, and Donald Trump. And as we know, Donald Trump would not exactly have been the most difficult person to capture in a honeypot operation. Now, it's just speculation, of course, but it's just not hard to imagine that they managed to get something on him to set him up. in some shape or form at some point in the history of his friendship with Jeffrey. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about here is the NDAA, the National Defence Authorization Act, because very mysteriously a clause appeared hidden away in that large document which would integrate Israel and US military. Now, this is really weird. Who put that in there? No one is owning it. You ask a senator who put that in there, who supports it, and no one, they're just putting up their hands and saying, I don't know. So how did it get in there? It will literally compromise US sovereignty in terms of foreign military policy. So it's shocking that it's even being considered, and yet it is, and very little discussion or opportunity for discussion or debate about that clause, let alone who put it in there, is being allowed. Remarkable. I would suggest it's exactly the sort of thing you might think would happen if the President of the United States was compromised by Israel. As I said, this is just ultimately speculation, but I think it is reasonable speculation, and I think I've presented a pretty reasonable argument. And in fact, if I am right, it would explain why Trump at one point was this big fan of the MOU, and now all of a sudden has completely abandoned it. Because by his own words, he fully understood the repercussions of the impending oil crisis, and now all of a sudden it's not in his vocabulary. It doesn't even feature on the radar. That doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense at all, unless you consider the possibility that he's being squeezed, and he has another reason for accelerating and escalating this conflict. Now, if I'm right, then we are all in much bigger trouble than we even think we are, because it means there's even less chance that he will back down. The famous taco may not happen, because he's not doing this because it's in his best interests to back down. In point of fact, he may see this as it being in his best interests not to back down, despite the fact it's going to bring a global economic crisis, a humanitarian crisis in the whole of the Middle East. And only Israel benefits from that. No one else. And perhaps Donald Trump, by the truth not coming out. And to be clear here, when you are caught in a situation like this, if he in fact is being manipulated, Israel doesn't win by exposing him. Israel wins by using their leverage on him to get him to do the things that they want him to do. So it's a subtle game, and it would explain the turnaround in relationship to the MOU, because they realized they needed to start turning the screws to get him back on track. Anyway, Bendy out.